On the busy streets of New York City, 11-year-old Sophie stood shivering in the cold. She didn't ask for much, just some food or a few coins. Her old backpack was the only thing left of her former life. When she saw a woman in a long black coat walking toward a car, Sophie gathered her courage and whispered timidly, "Excuse me, do you have $1?" She did not know that this woman was Angelina Jolie, and this meeting would change her life forever. The cold wind cut through the crowded streets of New York as 11-year-old Sophie pulled her thin hoodie tighter around her small frame. She had been standing near the bright neon lights of Times Square for over an hour, watching people hurry past with shopping bags, laughter, and warm cups of coffee. Her stomach twisted painfully with hunger, but what hurt more was the feeling of being invisible. She had never imagined her life would come to this. Just months ago, she and her mother had lived in a small but cozy apartment in Brooklyn. They weren't rich, but they had enough food, enough warmth, and most importantly, enough security. But everything had changed when her mother got sick. The doctors had diagnosed her with a severe illness, and the medical bills had piled up faster than she could work to pay them off. Soon, the eviction notice had come, and with nowhere else to go, they had been forced onto the streets. Now, their home was a small, abandoned basement near a closed-down laundromat. It wasn't much, but it was better than sleeping outside. Sophie spent her days wandering the streets, trying to find ways to help her mother. She wasn't used to asking for help. It felt embarrassing, even shameful. But as the nights grew colder and her mother's health worsened, desperation left her no choice. Her fingers gripped the straps of her old backpack as she scanned the street. Tourists took photos, street performers entertained crowds, and vendors called out, selling everything from pretzels to souvenirs. Nobody noticed her. Then she saw her. A woman in a long black coat stepped out of a nearby restaurant. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and she carried herself with effortless grace. Sophie wasn't sure why, but something about her felt different. Unlike the others who ignored her, this woman had kind eyes. Sophie hesitated for a moment before taking a deep breath and stepping forward. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you have $1? Just for some food." The woman stopped in her tracks and turned to face her. For a moment, Sophie thought she had made a mistake. Maybe she would get the same look people always gave her, pity or annoyance. But instead, the woman crouched down to Sophie's level, her eyes filled with something else entirely. "Concern. What's your name?" she asked gently. Sophie swallowed hard, gripping the hem of her hoodie. "Sophie," the woman smiled. Sophia. I'm Angelina." Sophie's breath hitched. The name sounded familiar, but her mind was too clouded with exhaustion and hunger to fully register it. Angelina studied her for a moment before speaking again. "Are you here alone?" Sophie shook her head quickly. "No, my mom, she's sick. We live in a basement. Not far from here." Angelina's eyes softened, and she stood up, pulling off the warm scarf from around her neck. Without hesitation, she wrapped it gently around Sophie's shoulders. The warmth was immediate, and for the first time that night, Sophie felt something other than cold and fear. "When's the last time you had a proper meal?" Angelina asked. Sophie hesitated, unsure how to answer. "A while ago," she admitted. "My mom gives me most of what we have." Angelina pressed her lips together, as if thinking. Then, she reached into her bag and pulled out a phone. "Come with me," she said. "Let's get you some food first, and then you can tell me more about your mom." Sophie hesitated. Her mother had always warned her about strangers. But something in Angelina's voice, in her eyes, told her she could trust her. Slowly, she nodded. A few minutes later, they were sitting inside a quiet cafe, away from the chaos of the streets. Sophie wrapped her hands around a cup of hot chocolate, letting the warmth seep into her frozen fingers. Angelina sat across from her, watching her with quiet patience. Sophie took a sip, the rich, sweet taste almost overwhelming after so many days of barely eating. She tried not to drink too fast, afraid it would be taken away. But Angelina simply smiled. "Eat as much as you want," she said kindly. "There's plenty more." Tears pricked at Sophie's eyes. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her like that, with kindness, without judgment. She took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long while, let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. And she had no idea just how much. Sophie sat in the warmth of the small cafe, feeling the heat slowly return to her fingers. The hot chocolate in her hands was half finished, but she held onto the cup tightly, as if afraid that letting go would make all of this disappear. Across the table, Angelina watched her with quiet patience, giving her space to gather her thoughts. The kindness in her eyes made Sophie feel safe in a way she hadn't felt in months. After a few minutes of silence, Angelina leaned forward slightly. "Sophie, can you tell me more about your mom?" Sophie hesitated. She wasn't used to talking about her life, especially to strangers. But something about Angelina made her want to trust her. She took a deep breath. She got sick a while ago. She used to work all the time, but then she started feeling really bad. She tried to keep working, but she couldn't. The bills piled up, and we lost our apartment. Angelina listened without interrupting, nodding gently as Sophie continued. "We stayed with a friend for a little while, but that didn't last. Then we had nowhere to go. My mom didn't want me to sleep on the streets, so we found an empty basement. It's not great, but keeps the rain out." Angelina's expression darkened with concern. "And your mom? How is she now?" Sophie shrugged, trying to hide the fear creeping into her voice. "She's really tired all the time. She sleeps a lot. I try to find food when I can, but it's getting harder. She doesn't want me to ask for help, but I didn't know what else to do." Angelina took a deep breath, considering Sophie's words carefully. "You did the right thing," she finally said. "Asking for help is never something to be ashamed of." Sophie nodded, but she wasn't sure she fully believed that yet. Years of struggling had taught her that most people turned away from those in need. But Angelina was different. Angelina glanced at her phone and then back at Sophie. "Would you be okay if we want to check on your mom? I want to make sure she's okay." Sophie hesitated. It wasn't that she didn't want help. It was that she didn't know how her mother would react. "She doesn't like people seeing us like this," Sophie admitted. "She's proud." Angelina smiled gently. "I understand, but we don't have to make a big deal out of it. I just want to see if she's all right." Sophie bit her lip, then slowly nodded. "Okay." The cafe door chimed as they stepped back into the cold night. Sophie led Angelina through a maze of streets, her small frame slipping easily between the crowds. Eventually, they reached the alleyway behind an old laundromat. Sophie hesitated at the entrance, glancing up at Angelina nervously. "This is it," she whispered. Angelina followed Sophie inside. The basement was dark and cold, the dampness in the air almost suffocating. Against the far wall, lying on a pile of blankets, was Sophie's mother. She looked pale, her breathing shallow. Angelina knelt beside her, gently touching her forehead. Her skin was cold. "Too cold. We need to get her help," Angelina said firmly. "Now." Sophie's heart pounded. "But we don't have money." Angelina placed a reassuring hand on Sophie's shoulder. "Don't worry about that. Just trust me." For the first time in a long time, Sophie felt like she didn't have to carry the weight of the world alone. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. Angelina didn't hesitate. She pulled out her phone and made a call while keeping her other hand on Sophie's shoulder, offering reassurance. Sophie watched nervously as Angelina spoke in a calm but firm voice, explaining the situation to someone on the other end. Within minutes, she had arranged for medical help. Sophie's mother stirred weakly, her eyelids fluttering open. She tried to sit up, but didn't have the strength. "Sophie." Her voice was hoarse and barely above a whisper. "I'm here, Mom," Sophie said, kneeling beside her. "I brought someone to help." Her mother's tired eyes flickered to Angelina. There was a flicker of fear, but also relief. "We don't need charity," she murmured. Angelina crouched down beside her, her expression gentle but resolute. "This isn't charity," she said softly. "This is help. There's a difference." Before Sophie's mother could protest further, the distant sound of sirens filled the air. Sophie looked up in alarm. "You called an ambulance?" Angelina nodded. "Your mom needs a doctor, and you both need a safe place to stay." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes. She had been fighting for so long, trying to take care of her mother, trying to be strong. But in that moment, as Angelina held her hand, she realized she didn't have to do it alone. The paramedics arrived quickly, moving with practiced efficiency. They checked her mother's vital signs, their faces serious. One of them turned to Angelina. She's severely malnourished and dehydrated. She needs immediate medical attention. Angelina nodded. Take her to the hospital. I'll make sure everything is covered. Sophie's mother looked up at her, eyes wide with disbelief. Why are you doing this? She whispered. Angelina smiled. Because sometimes we all need someone to step in and remind us that we don't have to face everything alone. Sophie squeezed her mother's hand as they loaded her into the ambulance. I'll be right behind you, she promised. Angelina placed a reassuring hand on Sophie's back. Let's go. They followed the ambulance to the hospital, where doctors immediately took Sophie's mother in for treatment. Sophie sat in the waiting room, her small hands clenched in her lap, nerves twisting in her stomach. Angelina sat beside her, offering silent support. Hours passed. Eventually, the doctor came out, looking relieved. She's stable, he informed them. She was severely undernourished, but with proper care, she should recover. Sophie exhaled a shaky breath. Can I see her? The doctor nodded. She's asking for you. Sophie looked up at Angelina, who smiled encouragingly. Go on. I'll be right here. Sophie rushed into the hospital room, her heart pounding. Her mother lay in a real bed, covered with warm blankets, and 4 in her arm. She looked exhausted, but better already. I'm so sorry, Mom, Sophie whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. I didn't know what else to do. Her mother reached for her hand, squeezing it weakly. You did the right thing, she murmured. You saved me. Sophie buried her face in her mother's shoulder, sobbing. For the first time in a long time, she felt safe. Outside, Angelina made another call. She had already started arranging for temporary housing and financial support. This wasn't just about one night in the hospital. This was about changing their future. And she wasn't going to stop until Sophie and her mother had everything they needed to rebuild their lives. Sophie sat beside her mother's hospital bed, her fingers gently tracing patterns on the blanket. The steady beeping of the monitors and the quiet hum of the hospital provided a strange sense of comfort, proof that her mother was finally getting the care she needed. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sophie wasn't worried about whether they would have a place to sleep that night or where their next meal would come from. Angelina had kept her promise. She had stayed at the hospital with Sophie, making sure everything was taken care of. Every time a doctor or nurse came in, Angelina would ask questions, ensuring Sophie's mother received the best possible treatment. After what felt like hours, a nurse walked in with a clipboard and a gentle smile. Good news, she said. Your mother is responding well to treatment. With proper rest and nutrition, she should be able to leave in a few days. Sophie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Thank you, she whispered. Angelina placed a reassuring hand on Sophie's shoulder. That's wonderful news, she said. Now we just need to focus on what happens next. Sophie frowned, unsure what she meant. Next, Angelina nodded. You and your mom can't go back to that basement. We need to find you a safe place to stay. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Sophie's face. But we don't have anywhere else to go. Angelina smiled warmly. I've already made a few calls. There's a temporary housing program that can provide a small apartment while your mom gets back on her feet. It's clean, warm, and safe. Sophie's eyes widened. Really? We won't have to sleep in the basement anymore. Angelina shook her head. Not anymore. And that's just the beginning. Tears filled Sophie's eyes, but this time they were tears of relief. I don't know how to thank you, she said softly. Angelina squeezed her hand. You don't have to. Just promise me one thing. Sophie sniffled and nodded. Anything. Angelina looked her in the eyes. Promise me that one day, when you're able, you'll help someone else the way you've been helped. Sophie nodded without hesitation. I promise. The next few days passed in a blur. Angelina arranged for everything, clothes, food, and transportation to their new home. When Sophie's mother was discharged from the hospital, she was overwhelmed by everything Angelina had done for them. I don't know how to repay you, she said as they stepped into the cozy apartment Angelina had arranged for them. It wasn't big, but to Sophie, it was perfect. There was a small bedroom, a kitchen, and most importantly, a door that locked. A place they could finally call home. Angelina shook her head. You don't have to repay me. Just focus on getting better. Sophie's mother wiped her tears away and hugged her daughter tightly. Thank you, she whispered to Angelina, for saving my little girl. Angelina smiled. She saved herself. I just helped. That night, as Sophie curled up in a real bed for the first time in months, she thought about the promise she had made. One day she would keep it. One day, she would be the one helping someone else find their way home. Months passed, and life slowly began to take shape again for Sophie and her mother. Their small apartment became a home, a place where laughter replaced silence, and warmth replaced the cold of the basement they had once called shelter. Sophie no longer wandered the streets, searching for scraps of food or a safe place to rest. Instead, she attended school regularly, focused on her studies, and even made new friends. Angelina continued to check in on them, ensuring they had everything they needed. She never treated them like a charity case or a project. She treated them like family. And in many ways, that's what she had become to Sophie. One afternoon, Sophie and her mother sat at their small kitchen table, flipping through a stack of paperwork. Sophie's mother had been offered a steady job at a local clinic, a position that would provide them with stability and long-term security. It was a chance to rebuild, to create a future they had once thought impossible. I still can't believe this is happening, her mother murmured, running her fingers over the official documents. After everything, I never thought we'd get here. Sophie smiled. Angelina believed in us. Her mother reached for Sophie's hand, squeezing it gently. And now we believe in ourselves. Sophie never forgot the promise she had made to Angelina the night her life changed. As she grew older, she found small ways to give back, volunteering at shelters, helping younger students in need, and always keeping an eye out for those who felt invisible, just as she once had. Years later, Sophie found herself standing in a familiar spot near Times Square, watching the crowds bustle past. She wasn't there for survival this time. She was there for a purpose. A small girl, no older than 8, sat on a bench, clutching a tattered backpack and glancing around nervously. Sophie recognized that look, the same fear and hesitation she had once felt. She walked over and knelt in front of the girl, offering a warm smile. "Hey there," she said gently. "Are you hungry?" The girl hesitated before nodding slightly. Sophie extended her hand. "Come on, let's get you something to eat." As they walked toward a nearby cafe, Sophie felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had come full circle. Once, someone had stopped and seen her when no one else had. Now, she had the chance to do the same for someone else. Later that evening, she pulled out her phone and sent a message. Sophie asterisk, I kept my promise. Minutes later, her phone buzzed with a reply. Angelina asterisk, I never doubted you. Sophie smiled, looking up at the city lights. She knew now that kindness wasn't just about a single moment. It was a ripple effect, spreading further than anyone could imagine. And thanks to one woman's kindness, she was ready to carry that legacy forward, one act at a time.